October 20th, 2022. I'm going to give a visual analogy of what I've been talking about on my channel since pretty much almost the beginning of this channel. Justice is fairness, and of course, I know I've mentioned John Rawls as the most famous person giving his reasons for why this is true, but I'm basically attempting to make people believe it by my own methods, which is what I've been doing on this channel for almost since the start, but I'm also going to try to give my own best visual analogy and explanation. I've been pretty much saying these things, using this wording to try to explain why, but it's failed, but we're going to keep trying. So alright, so brace yourself. So you have blank canvases. These are all supposed to be blank canvases I drew. Now keep in mind before we go any further that I want to mention blank canvases are not a perfect analogy to people, aka souls. They're not a perfect analogy. And the reason for that is because, well, canvases do not feel anything. They're not even living. And that's the most critical part to justice is fairness. Is feeling in general. Whereas, this, souls feel things, and that's a critical part. But since they can feel things, but canvases can't be a perfect comparison. But it's still going to work on some level to give a comparison of what I'm saying. So now, and so obviously that means these canvases are not really equal, necessarily. I mean, you could say that canvases can be unequal. I actually agree with that. Because they can be used for right or wrong, for just or unjust reasons. But they don't have feelings, so. Now, that isn't to say that the same logic would apply to souls. That isn't to say that if a soul does right or wrong, they're no longer equal with the other souls. That's not how it works with people, because they have to remain equal for all eternity. Because in the long term, there's going to be a way to justify the uneven distribution of the things felt. So they don't have to become unequal by doing different amounts of bad or good for that reason. Which I've already said this, but with the canvases, for those things causing more bad or more good than the other things, they won't be equal. And in the long term, I guess you could say they have no debt, really, because they're not living to begin with. So you can't punish them, so their justice doesn't apply to them in the way that it does to souls. You can't enforce justice upon them in the same ways. The closest you could do to that is to stop their reign of tyranny, or somehow disrupt their reign of non-tyranny. That is the closest you could do to enforce justice upon them, but you can't punish them insofar as you hurt them. That's the only real true punishment. So you can't truly punish them. You can't truly punish inanimate objects. You can't punish non-living things. As long as they're non-living, they're not being punished, and they can't be. Therefore, when I say they're equal in this analogy, it's not to be taken literally. It's just to give, if we pretend that these are the souls, it's the same. That's the idea. Drawing on them is like drawing on a canvas is like making modifications to a person's soul. I know you don't draw on a person's soul, but in metaphor you do. In metaphor, this is a metaphor. So there you go. But obviously, with canvases, if you did draw on them, they would be unequal. But if you modified a person's soul, it wouldn't make them unequal. It's not enough, because it depends what a thing's potential is. If a thing has high enough potential, then it essentially is protected by justice more. Souls have higher potential than non-living objects. Therefore, the non-living objects don't have high protection from justice. Or they do, but it's not going to be as high as the protection from justice as souls, because they're going to have protection from it into eternity, whereas these things are very temporary. These things will exist forever. Souls exist forever. Inanimate objects don't. Unless you're talking about ones in the afterlife, but I'm talking about ones on Earth. Those won't exist forever. So it's completely different. Canvases, like that's why I said when God first created souls, they're like blank canvases, And when they started being modified and doing things, they're still equal. Or imagine it like this: what if the canvases really were equal here, despite being drawn upon? Maybe it's because somehow they'll be distributed all the same things. They'll be equalized in the end through a certain set of things. Except obviously it doesn't make sense, because again, they can't feel anything, so it doesn't mean. So they don't really have any. The only value they really have is whatever value they can give to souls by serving the souls. But if they cannot serve the souls, then they're worthless. But since they can, they at least have some worth. But it's still not going to be as much worth for them to be able to be equal into eternity. So, but when you have souls, it's completely different. Now, of course, here's what it is. I call this one average Joes. I call this one average poorest people. They're both in the afterlife. I have the equal symbol because they're equal. That's fairness, is justice. What if the average Joes felt? In comparison, it's not the exact numbers, but generally, as I've been proving, and generally as most people agree, the poorest people feel more pain than they do pleasure, and the non-poorest people feel less pain than they do pleasure. But if they're truly equals, then this is an imbalance, it's injustice. So what average Joes deserve is to receive an increase so they catch up with this one, and by the logic of fairness, what average Joe needs to do to even out the odds perfectly, basically, like I was saying, mathematically, feel 100 times more pain and give 10,000 times more pleasure to the average poorest people. Now that's of course assuming that these are the only two people in the afterlife, and ever. Let's just say it's the only two people ever, right? Somehow this guy has caused all of this imbalance to happen to this person. So, aside from, of course, this person causing it to themselves by participating in the situation. So it's also the self is being, that person is responsible for injustice being committed to them by allowing it this one. But either way, at the end of the day, they'll still have to be equalized anyway, so. It's not so much about who caused it. It's just as long as they're received the same amounts after a certain point. They're equal either way by the definition I'm using. Of equal here, like they're intrinsically equal because they have the same, they'll be receiving the same long-term potential. The concept of hell, of course, completely disregards equality, despite Jesus ironically talking about how everybody's equal. It's completely bizarre and unfounded, as I've been saying. That's why I was saying it makes no sense, because it literally ignores. I mean, it's like the Bible is so stupid to the point where the writers literally knew that fairness is justice, but they couldn't. They realized it halfway writing it, and then they just ignored it later and contradicted it. It's like, if people really are equal, then why is there even a hell anyway? It makes no sense. If anything, God would just do everything in his power so that they do become equalized and don't receive eternal damnation. And just like do everything in his power to make them stop being crazy to do it. Even by the Bible's logic, it says it's impossible to do that, or it says it's possible, but if God does it, it's injustice. So it makes no sense. It's another contradiction in the Bible. So, of course, I've talked about this for a very long time, but still. So that basically means if the average Joe has felt way more pleasure than the average poorest person, it doesn't make him better. That's retarded. If they're equal, it wouldn't make him better. It would make him worse, if anything. But if fairness wasn't justice, and one person felt way more pleasure than the other person, you might be able to make an argument for why that person's better. Although it wouldn't really guarantee it, but they might be better. But again, that's only if fairness really wasn't justice. But even though, that's irrelevant to the conversation. But to bring up, at least it's irrelevant to have somebody bring up to this conversation, to the conversation of fairness. But although I will say that if you had a person like this, who, a poor person who felt way more pain, way less pleasure than the other person, the average person, it doesn't necessarily mean that the poor person is a better person, but because they might have a really bad personality and stuff, but well, actually no. If they had a really bad personality, but it was still at these amounts, then it just wouldn't matter. It wouldn't change anything. They'd still be the better person, because ultimately, all that really matters, as I've talked about, I have a video on this, the only real meaning in reality is pain and pleasure. It's feelings. And if there's no feeling, then all there is thoughts. But thoughts aren't feelings, and so, yeah, basically, if all you do is think, if all that there ever was thinking, then it would just be like pointless. It'd just be like, just there'd be no pleasure because there's no feeling, and there'd be no pain because there's no feeling. So, in a world without pleasure, and a world without pain, there's no problems, but there's no rewards. So if there's no problems or rewards in existence ever, then existence is meaningless. So there you go. Well, that's about what I got for this in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, subscribe.